Today the boring story name is The Tortoise Sleep by the Sea. This story is amazing and good. Which story is good? Please like, subscribe and share it to all your friends. Thanks a lot. Part 1 of 30, The Dreamer in the Dunes. In a forgotten cove where the sand was as white as powdered moonstone and the seaside more than it roared, there lived a tortoise named Torbjorn. But Torbjorn was not like other tortoises. His cousins were practical creatures, content to spend their days in a pleasant cycle of munching the salty dune grass, basking on sun-warmed rocks until their shells grew hot to the touch, and retreating into the cool, damp shadows beneath the beech lavender when the sun grew too fierce. Their world was immediate, tangible, and enough. Torbjorn's world was vaster, and this was the source of his quiet sorrow. While they basked, he would climb to the highest dune, a slow, deliberate pilgrimage that could take most of the morning. There, he would settle, his old, wise eyes the color of dark, wet kelp fixed not on the food at his feet, but on the endless, shifting line where the sky married the sea. He felt a deep, ancient pull in his stony heart, a longing for something he could not name. It was a feeling as constant as the tide, but instead of going out, it only ever flowed in, filling him with a sweet, heavy ache. The rushing waves seemed to whisper of journeys too swift for him. The scuttling sandpipers, with their frantic, mechanical legs, spoke of a pace that was alien. He felt like a monument in a world of minuets, profoundly out of rhythm. One evening, as the sun bled apricot and violet into the western sky, a mist the color of mother of pearl, cold and silent, began to roll into the cove. It softened the edges of the world, blurring the distinction between sea and sky, sand and air. Torbjorn was making his slow way back to his burrow when a faint, incongruous gleam caught his eye, half buried where the tide's fingers had last retreated. It was not the dull shine of a wet shell or a piece of slate. This was a deep, liquid azure. And cool, fitting neatly in the curve of his claw. It was made of glass, worn satiny by countless tides, and swirled within its heart were captured clouds of milky white, like a tiny, perfect captive storm. As he held it, a sensation bloomed in his chest, not a sound, but a warm, resonant hum, a vibration that traveled up his leg, through his shell, and settled the restless, yearning feeling in his heart for the first time in his long life. It did not silence the longing, it answered it. The hum said, "You are not wrong. You are not slow. You are listening for a song only you can hear." The sphere felt like a key, solid and true. But to what lock? To what door? Part 2 of 30, The keeper of the Tidepools. The next morning, with the sphere cradled carefully before him, Torbjorn made his slow way to the kingdom of his only friend. This was not the dry dunes, but the world of the Tidepools, a jagged, slippery tableau of black rock cradling miniature oceans that teemed with secret, busy life. In the grandest pool, nestled in a throne of emerald sea anemones and purple mussels, lived Nerissa. Nerissa was a venerable hermit crab of immense age and greater wisdom. Her shell was no ordinary whelk, it was a palace of calcified history, encrusted with layers of pink coral and algae, tiny, spiral tube worms, and barnacles that had seen seasons come and go. Her eyes, black and shining as wet pearls, missed nothing. Torbjorn placed the blue sphere on a flat rock beside her pool. Nerissa extended her long, spindly eye stalks, peering at it closely. She was silent for so long that a tiny hermit crab scuttled over her claw. Finally, she spoke, her voice a soft, dry clatter, like pebbles being gently stirred. "Ah," she breathed. "A sea dreamer's heart. I have seen one only once before, in the reign of my grandfather's shell. That was when the great black rock at the cove's mouth still had 2 arches, not one." She reached out with a careful claw and tapped the sphere. It chimed softly, the hum vibrating through the rock. "They are not for keeping, little mountain." She called him Little Mountain with deep affection, for to her, he was as solid and enduring as the land itself. "They are for following. This one, it is cold and quiet now, sleeping. It must be warmed by the heart fire to wake and show its true purpose." Torbjorn's heart, which had lifted at her recognition, now thumped a slow, heavy rhythm of trepidation. "And where is the heart fire, wise one?" Nerissa slowly turned, her cumbersome shell scraping on the rock. She lifted a claw, not toward the sea, but inland, toward the towering, jagged cliffs that formed the cove's southern wall. They were a fortress of stone, stained white by seabirds, their tops often shrouded in the clouds that gathered there. There, she clacked, her voice grave. Where the seabirds cry and the stone meets the sky. The path is not for the swift, but for the steadfast. It is a path of roots and crumbling stone, of patience and silence. She turned back and touched his front foot with the very tip of her claw, a gesture of profound tenderness. Listen to me, Torbjorn. Your shell is not too heavy, it is your anchor. Your pace is not too slow, it is your prayer. The cliff does not care for haste. It waits for a patient heart. Yours. Part 3 of 30. The first steps. Nerissa's words settled in Torbjorn's mind like stones in a calm pool. A path for the steadfast. Your pace is your prayer. He looked from the familiar, gentle curve of his dune to the distant, formidable face of the cliff. It seemed impossibly far, a world away. The journey to its base alone felt like a lifetime's endeavor. He began at dawn the next day. There was no dramatic farewell, for in the cove, departures and returns were as natural as the tide. He simply turned his shell from the rising sun and pointed it south, the blue sphere secured in a clever, woven sling of tough beach grass that lay against his chest, its cool hum a constant companion. The first league was across the open beach. Here, Torbjorn learned the first language of his pilgrimage, the language of sand. He felt the minute, granular shift from the soft, dry, yielding powder of the high dunes to the firm, cool, packed silk of the mid-beach, etched with the wind's tiny ripples. Then came the hard, damp planks near the tide line, where his claws left perfect, three-toed prints that filled slowly with seeping water. He crossed continents of texture, his world measured in square feet of experience. He was not traversing distance, he was communing with the skin of the earth. He rested in the lee of a giant, stranded driftwood log, silvered by sun and salt to the bone. The world here was different. The air smelled less of dry grass and more of wet stone and the rich, iodine scent of kelp. Great rubbery forests of it lay strewn across his path, their broad leaves like the banners of a sunken kingdom. When he walked over them, they released a pop of trapped air and a deep, green, salty perfume. He tasted a blade. It was thick, salty, and vital. As dusk painted the sky in watercolor washes, he found his shelter, a shallow cave at the base of a towering, striated boulder, its interior cool and smelling of ancient damp. He tucked himself in, the sphere glowing softly against his plastron. The symphony of the cove played a different movement here. The waves' crash was a deeper percussion, the wind song was channeled into a low thrum around the rock, and beneath it all was a new music, the tiny, ceaseless clicks, scrapes, and bubbles of the creatures who lived between the tides. It was a hidden, bustling world, and his slowness was the price of admission. For the first time, his deliberate pace felt not like a hindrance, but like a sacred act of attention. He was reading the great, sprawling book of the beach, savoring each sentence, while others lived their lives skimming only the chapter titles. Part 4 of 30. The Singing Shell. The journey to the cliff's foot took Torbjorn 3 full days, not days of arduous toil, but days of deep, immersive travel. On the evening of the third, the terrain began to change. The sand gave way to a coarse carpet of polished pebbles that clacked and shifted like ceramic teeth under his weight. The air grew cooler, spiced with the mineral smell of wet cliff stone. He made his camp in a soft, resilient patch of emerald moss that grew in the perpetual shade of the towering rock face. As he settled, arranging the sphere beside him, a new sound threaded its way through the familiar chorus of wave and wind. It was a clear, high, plaintive note, pure as crystal, that seemed not to come from the air, but to be born from the living rock itself. It hung for a moment, trembling, then faded, only to return again with the next breath of wind. Intrigued, Torbjorn followed the sound. It led him along the base of the cliff to a deep, narrow fissure, a vertical wound in the sandstone where fresh water seeped and dark moss flourished. Wedged tightly within the crack, as if placed by a careful giant, was a shell. But it was unlike any shell on the beach below. It was a grand, spiral conch, large enough that he could not have held it. Bleached by sun and salt to a heavenly, bone white. Its opening faced out toward the sea. He waited, patient as the stone. A gust of wind swept up the cove, funneled by the cliffs, and as it hit the fissure, it was forced through the shell's smooth, helical chamber. The shell transformed the random wind into a single, perfect, mournful note above middle C that vibrated in Torbjorn's very bones. It was a sound of ancient loneliness and profound beauty. As the note sang out, something magical happened. The blue sphere, resting against his chest, began to vibrate. Not a random shiver, but a deep, resonant hum that was the exact harmonic counterpart to the shell's cry. It was a conversation. The shell's note was a question cast into the universe, the sphere's hum was the calm, gentle answer from the deep. The air between them seemed to shimmer with silent understanding. Torbjorn did not need words. He felt the truth in the vibration. His journey was not a blind climb. It was a path of attunement. The cliff, the cove, the very world was filled with these notes, these places of power and song. The sea dreamer's heart was a tuning fork, and he was to help it find its harmony. He had discovered the first note. There would be others. With a heart full of quiet awe, he returned to his mossy bed, the two songs, one airy and sad, one deep and warm, lulling him to the deepest, most purposeful sleep of his life. Part 5 of 30, The Ascent begins with the dawn. Torbjorn faced the cliff. From the base, it was not a sheer wall, but a daunting, rugged slope, a chaotic avalanche of time-frozen sandstone, held together by tenacious networks of roots from hardy, wind-sculpted bushes that clung to life in mere pockets of soil. It was a staircase made for claws, wings, or roots, not for the smooth, rounded plates of a tortoise. He looked up. The summit was invisible, lost in a solemn wreath of mist that seemed to swallow the sky. A flicker of the old doubt whispered, "This is not for you." He took a deep, slow breath, filling his lungs with the cold, clean scent of sea and stone and moss. Nerissa's voice echoed, steadier than the doubt. "Your pace is your prayer." He placed his first foreclaw on a thick, gnarled root that emerged from the rock like a vein. It held. He shifted his immense, deliberate weight onto it, seeking balance. Then he brought a hind leg up, finding a notch in the sandstone. His progress, from that moment on, was measured not in feet per hour, but in inches. Each movement was a meditation. He learned to test every hold. A rock that looked firm could be treacherously loose, a root that seemed slender could have a grip of iron deep in the crack. He learned to distribute his weight with an ancient, embodied wisdom, to use his heavy shell not as a burden, but as a counterbalance. Bracing himself against the slope, the world narrowed to a profound focus. It was the next safe nook wide enough to rest his full belly. The next patch of sun-warmed stone where he could stop and feel the heat seep into his shell. The taste of a dewdrop on a blade of cliff grass. The blue sphere, in its sling, hummed softly with every deliberate, hard-won foot of altitude. It was not a song of triumph, but of companionship. I am here. You are here. This is the way. As he climbed, the sounds of the beach, the crash of waves, the cries of gulls, began to soften, folding into a new, higher altitude symphony, the whistle of a cleaner, sharper wind, the distant, echoing calls of birds nesting on ledges he could not yet see, the profound, almost silent groan of the ancient rock itself settling in the cool of the day. He was climbing a mountain, yes, but more importantly, he was climbing into a quieter, purer layer of the world, leaving the busyness below for a realm of elemental slowness and sky. Part 6 of 30, the storm. He had found a rhythm, a slow, steady cadence of climb, rest, and climb again. He was perhaps a third of the way up when the sky, which had been a friendly, mottled gray, began to bruise a deep purple. The wind, his constant companion, dropped away into an eerie, suffocating silence. The air grew heavy and cold. Torbjorn knew the signs, even here. He scanned the slope and spotted a deeper shadow, a shallow, scooped alcove in the rock, just large enough for him to squeeze into it. He was barely tucked inside when the storm broke. It was not a gentle rain. It was a furious, needle-like deluge that fell not in drops but in driven sheets, hitting the stone with a hiss that became a roar. The wind returned not as a breeze but as a gale, screaming as it was torn on the teeth of the cliff. It hurled the rain horizontally, and the once dry sandstone turned dark and slick in an instant, streams of muddy water beginning to cascade down the route he had just climbed. Fear, cold and sharp, uncoiled in his gut. It whispered that he was a fool, an arrogant pebble thinking it could climb a mountain. It told him he was too slow, that he would be stuck here, cold and starving, that the sphere was a meaningless trinket and his journey a dangerous fantasy. He pulled his head and legs deep into his shell, the familiar, dark safety of his own bony architecture. The world was reduced to the deafening chaos outside and the pounding of his own heart within. Then, through the panic and the cold seeping into his shell, he felt it. A warmth. A vibration. The blue sphere, pressed against his chest in the confined space, was awakening. It began to glow, a soft, steady, azure light that illuminated the intricate patterns on the inside of his own shell, patterns he had never seen. Its hum deepened, transforming from a gentle companion to a tangible, thrumming warmth that spread from the point of contact, radiating through his plastron, up into his body, and out through the very carapace that encased him. It was not a magic that could silence the storm outside, but it performed a greater magic. It stilled the storm inside him, the fear melted before the warmth. The cold retreated. The sphere's hum became a mantra, a physical reminder of his purpose, his solidity. Huddled in his shell, lit from within by this captured piece of sea and sky, he was no longer a creature caught in a tempest. He was a small, complete, and warm world unto himself, a planet with its own sun and its own gravity. He was where he was meant to be. Lulled by the sphere's resonant peace and the rhythmic fury of the gale, Torbjorn, the sleepy tortoise, closed his eyes and slept, perfectly safe, while the world raged around his unshakable calm. Part 7 of 30, The Gifts of the Tempest. He awoke to a world washed new. The silence was immense, broken only by the peaceful drip of water from 1,000 leaves and stone lips. The air, scoured clean by the storm, tasted of ozone and wet granite. Torbjorn unfurled himself from his shell, his limbs stiff but rested. The alcove was flooded with soft, golden dawn light, and the blue sphere against his chest had returned to its quiet, cool hum, the inner light banked like a hearth after a long night. When he peered out, the path he had climbed was gone, transformed into a network of glittering silver streams and miniature waterfalls. But the storm had also been a sculptor. It had scoured away loose soil and gravel, revealing new, more solid handholds, a ledge he hadn't seen, a root system laid bare like a stone gripping net. More wondrous still, in the hollows where water had pooled, tiny, perfect ecosystems had sprung to instant life. Bright green mosses plumped with moisture, and fragile, white cliff flowers he had never seen before unfurled their petals to the new sun. Bejeweled with raindrops, the storm had not been an obstacle, it had been a revealer. It had stripped the cliff down to its bones and then adorned it with fleeting, freshwater jewels. Torbjorn drank from a clear pool, the water cold and sweet. His journey resumed, not with trepidation, but with a renewed sense of discovery. Each step was firmer on the washed stone. The sphere hummed contentedly, as if pleased with the fresh, clean world. Part 8 of 30, The Eyrie of the Windsinger's a day's climb above the storm's gift. The character of the cliff changed again. The rugged slope gave way to a series of broader, grassy ledges that jutted out like the balconies of a stone castle. And here, the air was filled with sound, not the roar of wind, but a cacophony of shrieks, chatter, and the powerful beat of wings. He had entered the eyrie of the seabirds. They were everywhere, puffins with comically serious faces, kittiwakes crying their own names, razorbills standing like sentinels. At first, they swarmed around him, a noisy, chaotic cloud of black, white, and red. To them, this slow, strange rock creature was an anomaly. But Torbjorn did not flinch or hide. He simply continued his slow, methodical pace across their ledge, a mountain moving through a sky of feathers. A large, graying gull, a patriarch with one milky eye, landed on a rock before him, blocking his path. It cocked its head and let out a challenging shriek. Torbjorn stopped. He did not retreat. He slowly extended his neck and met the bird's fierce gaze with his own calm, kelp-dark eyes. He held the stare for a long, quiet moment. The sphere hummed softly, the gull's aggression seemed to falter. It squawked again, but this time the note was less confrontational, more curious. It hopped aside. Torbjorn dipped his head in a slow, deliberate nod and moved on. The birds, sensing no threat, began to ignore him. Their chaos continued around him, but he moved through it like a stone through a river, unmoved, steady, and ultimately accepted. He was not of their world, but he was in it, on his own terms, and his calm demanded respect. Part 9 of 30, the goat of the high places above the bird cliffs, the vegetation grew sparse and tough. The wind returned, a constant, buffeting force. Here, Torbjorn found the true hermit of the heights. He was an old, shaggy mountain goat, his coat the color of the fog, his horns thick and spiraled with the rings of many years. He stood on a pinnacle of rock no larger than a dinner plate, seemingly defying gravity, chewing on a bitter-looking thistle. The goat watched Torbjorn's laborious approach for an hour before speaking. His voice was a dry, rasping bleat, like rocks grinding together. "You are far from your lettuce, shellback." Torbjorn paused, catching his breath. "I am seeking the heart fire." The goat let out a sound that might have been a laugh. "Fire? There is no fire up here. Only wind, stone, and cold. The sun is fire enough, when it bothers to visit." He leapt effortlessly from his spire to a ledge just above Torbjorn. Why? Why climb to a cold fire? "To wake a dream," Torbjorn said simply, nodding to the sphere. The goat peered down, his yellow eyes intelligent. "Poof. A pretty pebble. I have seen these ledges give birth to crystals that dream deeper dreams. They grow slow, like you. Perhaps your fire is not a flame, but a growth. A slow, patient waking." He turned to go, then looked back. "The path ahead is not for climbing. It is for balancing. Your shell will be a burden there. Or an advantage. See it not as weight, but as a counterweight. The wind will be your partner, not your enemy. Lean into it." With another dizzying leap, he was gone, vanishing into the mist. Part 10 of 30, the path of balance. The goat's words proved prophetic. The cliff face here was not a slope, but a series of immense, tilted slabs of stone, a giant staircase that had slipped. They were slick with condensation and wide, with terrifying drops on one side. This was not climbing, it was traversing. The wind howled across these open plates, threatening to peel him off the rock. Remembering the goat's advice, Torbjorn did not fight the wind. When a gust shoved at his left side, he did not strain to hold center. He allowed it to push him, leaning his heavy shell into the gust, letting the wind's force press his climbing side claws more firmly into the microscopic cracks of the stone. His shell was his ballast. The wind, his unpredictable partner, told him where to place his weight. It was a terrifying, exhilarating dance. He moved sideways across the great stones, inch by deliberate inch, his world reduced to the next clawhold and the press of the air. The sphere was silent, as if holding its breath. Halfway across the most exposed slab, the wind died abruptly. The sudden silence was more alarming than the roar. In the stillness, he felt the true, dizzying void at his side. He froze. Then, a gentle, warm updraft rose from the sun-warmed stone below. It lifted the edge of his shell, just slightly, a supportive hand. It was the cliff itself, offering aid. He breathed out, a slow hiss, and continued. He was not a climber conquering a mountain. He was one part of the mountain, the slow, deliberate part, in conversation with the wind and the stone. Part 11 of 30, the echoing cave beyond the slabs. The cliff folded in on itself, creating a deep, shadowy grotto. Its entrance was hidden by a curtain of hanging ivy. Inside, it was cool, dark, and smelled of deep earth and cool stone. The sound of the wind vanished, replaced by the magnified drip of water from the ceiling into a still, black pool. Torbjorn entered, the sphere's glow providing a soft blue lantern. As his claws clicked on the stone, the cave answered. Not with an echo, but with a hum. A low, resonant frequency that came from the walls themselves. He let out a low, rumbling breath. The cave breathed back, a deeper, longer hum that made the sand on the floor tremble. He tapped a claw on a stalagmite. A clear, bell-like tonk rang out, hanging in the air. This was another note. Not a lonely song like the shell, but the earth's own foundational chord. He sat in the center of the cave for a long time, breathing with it, tapping small rhythms, listening to the cave's replies. The blue sphere vibrated on his chest, not in harmony this time, but in resonance. It tuned itself to the cave's deep frequency, its glow pulsing softly. He wasn't just passing through, he was tuning the instrument of himself to the song of the world. When he left, the cave's hum seemed to follow him for a few steps, a farewell from the cliff's heart. Part 12 of 30, The Summit and the Veil of Mist. The final ascent was the gentlest, a slow, spiraling ramp of scree and tough, wind-cropped grass. The air grew thin and cold, but it was incredibly pure, carrying the distant, salty tang of the sea from an impossible height. The cacophony of the world below, the waves, the gulls, even the wind, had softened into a uniform, soothing whisper. Torbjorn moved as if in a dream, his body weary but his spirit alight, and then, the ground beneath him leveled. He had reached the summit. But there was no panoramic view, no triumphant vista. Instead, he stood at the edge of a great, silent sea of cloud. A dense, luminous mist, the veil he had seen from below, swirled around him, swallowing all sight beyond a few feet. The world was reduced to this soft, gray-white stillness. The sphere against his chest, which had hummed and glowed at various notes, fell into a deep, profound silence. It was not asleep. It was waiting. Disorientation prickled at him. Had he climbed all this way for nothing but a cloud? He stood still, breathing the damp air. Then, he felt it. Not a sound, but a presence. A deep, gentle warmth radiating up through the stone beneath his feet. It was a geothermal warmth, the living breath of the mountain itself. This was not the end. The summit was not the destination, it was the antechamber. The heartfire was here, somewhere within this veil. Part 13 of 30, The Amphitheater of Stone. Guided by the increasing warmth underfoot, Torbjorn moved inward. The mist began to thin, not revealing open sky, but coalescing into the walls of a colossal, natural amphitheater. The cliff top was not a peak, but a bowl, a hidden, scooped-out sanctuary protected from all winds. And in the very center lay the heartfire. It was not a flame. Nerissa's words made sense now. It was a wide, shallow basin of bare, dark rock, from which rose a constant, shimmering heat haze. The rock itself glowed with a deep, inner warmth, like a banked forge. No fire burned, but life flourished in its radiant embrace. The entire basin and the surrounding stone were covered in a carpet of the most extraordinary moss Torbjorn had ever seen. It glowed with a soft, bioluminescent green, pulsed with a light of its own, mirroring the slow rhythm of the earth's warmth. Tiny, delicate ferns unfurled in the humid air, and crystal-clear water seeped from the walls, trickling into miniature streams that vanished into the warm rock with a gentle hiss. It was alive. It was a heart warm, beating softly, nurturing life in its secluded cradle. The blue sphere on Torbjorn's chest awoke. Its hum returned, not as a song, but as a deep, resonant thrum of recognition, like a lost child finding its parent. The light within it swirled furiously. Part 14 of 30, The Awakening. With a reverence that filled his slow being, Torbjorn approached the rim of the warm basin. The heat was intense but not painful, a comforting, penetrating warmth that seeped into the very marrow of his bones, soothing aches he didn't know he carried. He carefully loosened the sling and, using his nose, nudged the blue sea dreamer's heart forward until it rested on the very edge of the glowing moss, half touching the warm stone. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the moss where the sphere touched brightened, its green light flowing into the blue glass like liquid emerald. The swirling white storm inside the sphere began to move, not chaotically, but in a deliberate, beautiful pattern. The sphere's hum rose in pitch and volume, harmonizing with the low, subaudible thrum of the geothermal basin. It was a duet between the deep earth and the captured sky sea. The sphere did not melt or crack. Instead, it became translucent, then transparent. For a few breathtaking seconds, it was not a sphere at all, but a window. Within it, Torbjorn saw not a reflection, but a vision, his own cove, seen from a great height, but also from within, every creature, every plant, every grain of sand connected by threads of soft, gold light. He saw the slow, patient network of roots in the dune, the paths of the tides, the sleeping hermit crabs, the soaring birds, all part of a single, breathing, dreaming entity. The cove was alive, and he was a beloved, steady pulse within its vast, slow heart. Part 15 of 30, the mark of resonance. The vision faded. The sphere became opaque again, but it was changed. It no longer felt like a separate object. It felt like an extension of his own body, warm and humming with the same frequency as the heart fire beneath it. As he watched, the heat and light from the basin seemed to concentrate around him. The glowing moss at his feet brightened. The warm haze in the air shimmered. Then, a gentle, tingling sensation spread across his carapace. He couldn't see it, but he could feel it, a subtle etching, as if the very energy of the place was writing upon him. It was not painful, but profound, like a whisper being carved into his soul's skin. The patterns he had glimpsed inside his shell during the storm, the intricate, swirling lines, were now being inscribed on the outside, glowing faintly with the same bioluminescent green as the moss before fading to a permanent, elegant tracery in his dark shell. They were maps of ocean currents, of constellations, of the spiraling pattern inside the sphere itself. He was being marked. Not owned, but recognized. Harmonized, the sphere's work was done. Its hum settled into a contented, barely perceptible vibration, identical to the ambient pulse of the heart fire. Torbjorn understood. The heart fire didn't need to be woken up. It was always awake. The sphere was a key that had woken him up to his place, to the music of the world, to the fact that the peace he sought was not a place to find, but a state of being to remember. He had carried his shell to the summit, only to discover the summit had always been within it. Part 16 of 30, the descent begins. He did not stay long at the summit. The purpose was fulfilled, and a new, gentle urgency called him home. The descent was a different journey. He was not a seeker weighed down by longing, but a sage carrying a quiet truth. His body was tired, but his spirit was light. The marked shell did not feel heavier, it felt right, as if he had been wearing an ill-fitting coat his whole life and had only now shrugged into his own true skin. The path down was familiar, yet seen with new eyes. The treacherous slabs where he had danced with the wind were now a known dance floor. He moved across them with a calm confidence, his shell, his counterweight, now feeling like a part of the mountain itself returning home. The wind, his old partner, now felt like a guide, ushering him downward. The goat was nowhere to be seen, but Torbjorn felt his presence in the certainty of his own steps. Part 17 of 30, the changed song. When he reached the echoing cave, he did not just pass through. He entered and let out a low, rumbling breath, as before. The cave hummed its deep, foundational note in reply. But this time, Torbjorn's shell resonated with it. The markings on his carapace seemed to thrum in harmony. The cave's hum grew richer, fuller, as if pleased to be met by an equal. He was no longer just an visitor tuning himself, he was a part of the instrument, adding his own note to the chord. He left the cave with the sense that its song would now be slightly different, slightly more complete, because he had passed through. Part 18 of 30, the return to the Eyrie. Passing through the seabird Eyrie was a revelation. The chaotic shrieking din greeted him as before. But as he moved onto the ledge, something shifted. The birds did not just ignore him. They quieted. Not all at once, but in a rippling wave. The old gull with the milky eye landed before him again, not blocking his path, but observing. It tilted its head, looked at the new markings on his shell, and let out a soft, guttural croak that was almost respectful. Then it took off, leading the way, its flight a slow glide rather than a frantic beat. The other birds parted before him, their noise dropping to a murmur. They sensed the change. He carried the quiet of the summit with him, and it demanded a different kind of attention. Part 19 of 30, the beach of homecoming. The final descent to the beach felt like shedding layers of a distant, harder world. The salt spray air grew thicker, warmer, familiar. The roar of the surf, once a symbol of his restless longing, now sounded like a welcoming chorus. When his claws finally sank into the soft, white sand of his home cove, it was not an ending, but a true beginning. He made his way first to Nerissa's Tidepool kingdom. The old hermit crab was dozing on her throne of anemones when his shadow fell across her pool. Her eye stalks extended slowly. She looked at him, not at his face, but at his shell. She was silent for a long, long time, the only sound the gentle lap of water in her pool. Finally, she spoke, her clatter softer than ever. "Ah, little mountain. You have been to the fire." It was not a question. "And it has left its whisper upon you." She reached out with a claw and, with infinite gentleness, tapped his shell, just below the new, elegant markings. A soft, clear ping rang out, a note purer than any shell or cave could produce. "You do not carry a key anymore. You have become one. The cove will listen to you now." Torbjorn dipped his head low in gratitude. "You showed me the way, wise one." "You showed yourself," she corrected. "I merely pointed at the mountain. You were the one who learned to speak its language." She settled back into her pool. "Go. The dunes have missed their dreamer." Part 20 of 30, the dune transformed. He returned to his high dune. The view was the same, the endless sea, the curve of the bay, the distant cliffs now holding his secret. Yet, everything was different. He did not feel loneliness looking at the horizon, he felt connection. He understood now that the line between sea and sky was not a boundary, but a meeting place, just as the heartfire was a meeting place of earth's warmth and the sky's breath. He settled into his old spot, but his posture had changed. Before, he had hunched, as if carrying the weight of the sky. Now, he sat upright, solid and open, his marked shell facing the sea like a shield and a receiver. The restless ache was gone, replaced by a deep, resonant calm that was more active than stillness. It was a listening, a participation. He was not apart from the cove, he was a tuned instrument within its symphony. That evening, as the sun set, a curious thing happened. A young sandpiper, skittish and quick, darted near his resting form. Instead of fleeing, it paused, tilting its head at the strange patterns on his shell. Then, it hopped closer, and with a fluff of its feathers, settled in the warm sandly of his massive form, tucking its beak under its wing. It had found, in the once lonely dreamer, a safe harbor. Part 21 of 30, the first listener word, in the way of wild places, began to spread. It was not spoken word, but a change in the air, a new frequency. The next day, it was a pregnant hare, her nerves on edge, who lingered near him while she nibbled grass, soothed by his immovable stillness. The day after, a butterfly, its wings frayed from a long journey, landed on the highest point of his shell and rested for an hour, as if recharging from a battery of peace. They did not come for food or conversation. They came, it seemed, to bask in the quiet field he now carried. The markings on his shell were not just for show, they were a symbol of an internal shift. He had integrated the slow, deep rhythm of the heartfire, and it radiated outwards, a balm for the frantic, fearful, or weary creatures of the cove. The sleepy tortoise was no longer an epithet for a lazy daydreamer. It became a title for a sanctuary. Part 22 of 30, the story of the storm. The first one to actively seek his counsel was a young gull, its feathers still smudged with gray from youth. It had been caught in a squall the previous night and was trembling, its eyes wide with residual fear. It landed awkwardly near Torbjorn. The wind, it tried to break me, the gull choked out. Torbjorn was silent for a moment, remembering the cliff, the screaming gale, the blue light in his shell. He spoke slowly, his voice the sound of stones grinding gently in a deep tide. The wind does not try to break you, he rumbled. It tries to find your shape. To show you where your strength is. I leaned into it, and it held me up. The young gull blinked. You leaned into it? Your hollow bones are not for fighting the wind, Torbjorn said. They are for dancing with it. Let it find your wings. It is not your enemy. It is the sky's breath, and you are a child of the sky. The gull, still shaky, seemed to ponder this. It didn't fly away immediately, but sat, its trembling gradually subsiding as it absorbed the tortoise's unshakable calm. Part 23 of 30, the rhythm of the tides. His most constant student, however, was the cove itself. He began a new ritual. As the tide receded, he would make his slow way down to the hard, wet sand and simply wait. He wasn't looking for food. He was listening with his whole body. He felt the minute vibrations of countless buried clams squirting, the scritch-scratch of sandhoppers, the deep, hydraulic sigh of the water pulling tons of sand back into the sea. He began to sense the rhythm beneath the rhythm. The twice-daily pulse of the tides was the heartbeat, but within it were subtler rhythms, the weekly spring tides that dug deeper, the neap tides that were a gentle whisper, the seasonal shifts in current. He could sit at the water's edge and know, in his bones, if the next wave would be a gentle lapper or a crashing roller. He didn't need to fear the sea's power anymore, he understood its intention. He had become a living tide clock, his internal peace synchronized with the greatest pulse on earth. Part 24 of 30, the new dream. His sleep changed. The dreams of vague, horizon longing were gone. Now, when he slept, he dreamed in patterns of connection. He would see the root systems of the dune grasses stretching like silver nerves, connecting to the mycelial webs in the soil, which touched the filter-feeding mussels, whose lives were tied to the plankton, which fed the small fish, which were watched by the gulls. He saw the cove not as a collection of things, but as a single, vast, dreaming organism. And in the center of that web of golden light, a steady, slow pulse emanated from a small, dark shape on a high dune, himself. He was not the center of the cove, but he had become a vital, calming nexus within it. He awoke from these dreams not weary, but replenished, as if he had been drinking from a deep well of communal peace. His slow movements through the day were not a limitation, but the necessary pace for processing this vast, quiet knowledge. Part 25 of 30, the legacy of patient. Seasons turned. Torbjorn grew older, his movements even slower, but his presence only grew more profound. Young tortoises, born in the dunes, would sometimes follow him on his rounds, not to mimic his slowness, but to learn his attention. They learned to watch a single flower for an hour to see which bee visited it. They learned to sit so still that the sandpipers would mistake them for rocks. The story of the sleepy tortoise who climbed the cliff to wake a dream on a blue stone became a legend, passed down by Nerissa to new generations of crabs and by the old goat, who occasionally visited the cliff's base to tell the tale with embellished leaps, to the young kids. But the greater lesson was not in the legend, it was in his daily existence. He was living proof that in a world of rush and noise, supreme power and deep peace could be found in absolute slowness, in patient listening, in becoming part of the rhythm rather than fighting against it. Part 26 of 30, the great slow festival. As the years smoothed the edges of the dunes and the cliffs, a new tradition was born in the cove, one that moved at the speed of growing moss. It had no name, but the creatures knew it as the time of the great slow. It began not with a signal, but with a feeling, the day of exceptional calm, when the sea lay like a sheet of hammered silver and the air was so still you could hear a spider weaving its web 3 dunes over. On such a day, the creatures would gradually, without fuss, gravitate towards the high dune. The hares would cease their frantic boxing and sit, ears twitching softly. The gulls would land and preen in silence. The sandpipers would stop their manic stitching along the tide line. Even the scuttling crabs would find a sunny stone and grow still. Nerissa would emerge from her Tidepool and position herself on a commanding rock, a silent matriarch. They would gather around Torbjorn, who sat in his usual spot, eyes half closed, breathing in a rhythm so slow it seemed to match the turning of the earth. No speeches were made. No songs were sung. For hours, they simply existed together in a shared, profound silence. It was a collective exhalation, a meditation on simply being. In that silence, under the wide sky, the frantic separateness of their lives dissolved. The predator and prey, the flyer and the crawler, all were just parts of the cove, resting in the deep peace emanating from their still, stone-hearted center. The festival ended as it began, with a gradual, gentle dispersal as the afternoon light grew long, each creature carrying a piece of the shared calm back to its own life. Part 27 of 30, the passing of the shell. Torbjorn's time, as all times must, drew towards its gentle close. He did not grow sick, but simply slower, until one day his movements ceased altogether. He chose his spot on the high dune, faced the sea, and withdrew into his magnificent, patterned shell for the last time. The life force, that slow, patient pulse, left him as quietly as the tide leaving a rock pool for a day and a night. The cove held its breath. The wind dropped. The waves seemed to hush. The next morning, Nerissa was the first to approach. She tapped his shell with her claw. Not the living ping, but a final, hollow talk. She bowed her head, then turned and made her slow way back to her pool, her own shell seeming heavier with the weight of farewell, but there was no decay, no scavenging. The creatures of the cove, in a silent, unanimous agreement, left his form untouched. They understood. His body was no longer his home, it was now a monument, a permanent part of the landscape he had loved and helped them all see. Sand began to drift against the lee of his shell. Seeds, carried by the wind, found purchase in the grit that collected there. Part 28 of 30, the living cairn. Seasons turned. The shell, a sturdy architecture of bone and keratin, endured. It became a living cairn. Mosses, green and gold, velveted its curves. Lichens, like ancient maps, painted its surface in oranges and grays. The small flower that first took root was joined by others, until a tiny, perfect hanging garden flourished in the bowl of his back. It became a haven for the smallest of lives. Beetles trundled along its ridges, spiders spanned its openings with dewdrop lace, and on stormy nights, the smallest of birds would shelter in its lee. Children of the creatures who knew him, young hares, new fledgling gulls, would ask about the strange, flower-covered hill on the dune. Their parents would tell them the story of the sleepy tortoise, not as a myth of magic fire, but as a lesson in stillness. That, they would say, is where true patience lived. Sit by it, and you might feel a little of its calm. The shell was no longer a relic of a creature, but an active shrine to an idea that slowness is not emptiness, but a different kind of fullness. Part 29 of 30, the whisper in the waves. Generations passed. The specific memory of Torbjorn, the individual tortoise, faded into the general memory of the cove. But the change he wrought did not. The rhythm of the place was permanently altered. The creatures retained a touch more patience, a moment more of stillness before panic. The great slow festival continued instinctively on calm days, though none could say why they gathered on that particular dune. Part 29 of 30, the whisper in the waves. Generations passed. The specific memory of Torbjorn, the individual tortoise, faded into the general memory of the cove. But the change he wrought did not. The rhythm of the place was permanently altered. The creatures retained a touch more patience, a moment more of stillness before panic. The great slow festival continued instinctively on calm days, though none could say why they gathered on that particular dune, and on the clearest, quietest nights, when the moon laid a path of shattered silver on the sea, something new could be heard. If you sat on the beach, where the waves barely kissed the sand, and listened not to the crash but to the sigh, the final, soft exhalation of each wave as it spent itself, you could hear it. A faint, rhythmic undertone within the sigh, a deep, resonant hum that was not water or wind. It was the sound of perfect peace. The old ones, the Narissas of new generations, would say it was the mountain breathing, or the stars singing. But those who felt it in their bones knew it was the cove itself, dreaming a slow, contented dream, its heart beating in a rhythm first learned from a tortoise who taught it how to rest. The last part of the story, the endless beach, and so, the cove endures. The cliffs still stand, guarding their secret fire. The tides still pulse, their rhythm now carrying a whisper of ancient calm. The dunes still shift, but one mound, perpetually green and flowering, remains constant. If you were to walk that beach today, you would feel it. A profound, settling peace that seeps up from the sand itself. You might see a hare pause mid-run to simply watch a cloud, or a gull sit for an hour staring at the horizon without hunger, only contemplation. You wouldn't know why. But the story is there, written not in books, but in the patience of the stones, the resilience of the moss on a certain shell, and the extra beat of silence between the crash of waves. For in the end, the sleepy tortoise by the sea did not just find his peace. Through infinite patience and a journey measured in heartbeats, he wove that peace into the very fabric of his world. He became a legend, then a memory, then a feeling, the gentle, unshakable feeling that here, in this place, you are allowed to be slow. You are allowed to be quiet. You are allowed to simply be, as part of the great, slow, beautiful dream of the world. And that, perhaps, is the coziest bedtime story of all. Thanks to watching this beautiful boring story. Please like, subscribe, comment, and share it to all your friends. Thanks a lot.